and play, and if the tone of our fathering is positive and we talk to our kids a lot, we'll probably do well. A working definition of fathering might be this. Fathering is the act of guiding a child to behave in ways that lead to the child's becoming a secure child in full, thus increasing his or her chances of being happy and fruitful as a young adult. This childhood season, spring, lived well, increases chances of a fruitful young adulthood, summer, and so on through fall and winter, each preparing for the next stage. The early worldview of a child, the experience of seeing the world afresh, can be intoxicating for both child and father. When one of my aunts died about a year ago, this new seeing was demonstrated, if a bit morbidly. Just before the funeral started, I entered the back of the church with our 3 little ones and with my wife, Christina. A cousin walked up and said, "The casket is still open if you want to view her." I looked at my children standing at my feet and staring up at me in bewilderment. They weren't familiar with what they'd just heard. What I next said to the kids, in large part because my mother took me to open casket funerals about as often as she took me to the grocery store, a lot, was, "Come on, let's go." At the casket, the kids lined up with their chins almost on the creamy white silk lining. I stood behind them. Ridley, age 6, turned, looked up at me, and whispered, "Is she dead?" I nodded yes. My 5-year-old Truma turned and whispered something to me. I leaned in closer. "What? Was she always dead?" From a child's perspective, reasonable questions. From an adult's perspective, odd questions. Being a father can unreason your worldview, or at least make it very flexible, and that can create all sorts of fun and insights. It's sad that children's open-eyed wonder and sense of play begin to fade as they approach adolescence. One grand function of fathering is to keep the fading to a minimum. By sometimes being playful and silly with my kids, I may help them hang on to some of the best parts of childhood, and thus reduce my chances of impeding that flow of healthy life through them. I want this book to give you some good ideas, to take away some apprehension about that first year or so with your child, and to help you look forward to fatherhood. So I'll cover several important aspects of dealing with babies, toddlers, and little children in the first few parts of this book, before jumping to the long view in a later section. I'll not usually break things down by months and stages, 0 to 6 months, 6 to 18 months, etc. In general, children know more than you think. And if you're wondering whether or not they're ready for a certain game, food, or task, try it and find out. If you're wondering about it, they're probably ready. My older daughter Catherine was ready to eat mashed potatoes before she could talk, and Nathaniel, my older son, was eating barbecued ribs very early on. I will sometimes assume as I write that you have more than one child, but only one is sufficient for what we're about. That reminds me of the elderly woman living in a mountain hollow. She walked with a cousin into town at Christmas one year, observed a nativity scene, turned to her cousin and said, "She only had the one, didn't she?" If you were an only child, you remember the ups and downs of that. I was an only child, and I remember wishing I had a brother or sister. If you had a sibling or two, my guess is that you sometimes wished you were an only child. As for more than one child, I'm reminded of the grandma who, at a family reunion, walked through a living room, past a couch with 6 or 8 baby dolls lined up on it, and on into the kitchen. She said to a couple of the women, "Whose children are them in there? They wouldn't even speak." And, oh yes, there was the older nurse and the younger nurse with me in the emergency room one time. I'd brought in my 5-year-old son, who'd stuck one of my hearing aid batteries into his ear, way down into the canal, barely visible. It was finally removed with a little suction apparatus, and my hospital bill thus included a significant charge.